Hello, everyone. Welcome to Foreign Objects book reading and panel discussion for David Roden's newly published book, Snuff Memories, Schism Press, 2021. In this seminar, we're honored to have 5 contemporary thinkers and writers, Amanda Beech, Martin Rosenberg, Romina Weinberg, Corey McCall, and Simon Sellars, consider the themes and questions thrown up by the novella in dialogue with its author, David Roden. In David Roden's Snuff Memories, an ancient time war ripples through a demon-haunted cosmos as its characters systematically expunge their humanity. Their post-human becoming preempts any possible ethics or sane politics. Instead, desire is weaponized from a bleak, inhuman future. Bodies replicate and unzip across the novella's pornographic vignettes, remade in erotic rituals of mutation, death, and pain. Snuff Memories explores themes common to the discourses of new realism, posthumanism, accelerationism, and weird fiction, the cultivation of general intellect, the storming of heaven, our complicity with alien intelligences and uncontrollable technologies, the possibilities of an ethics of becoming inhuman in a world without transcendental norms. We're starting this event with the author, David Roden. David's research has addressed the relationship between deconstruction and analytic philosophy, philosophical naturalism, the metaphysics of sound, and posthumanism. His monograph, Posthuman Life, Philosophy at the Edge of the Human, New York 2014, explores the ethical and epistemological ramifications of speculative posthumanism. The thesis that there could be agents originating in human social technical systems that become post-human as a result of some technological alteration of their powers. His current work considers post-humanist theories of agency and their implication for aesthetics and philosophical method. Roden also writes experimental fiction and concept horror works. His experimental novella, Snuff Memories, is published by Schism Press, 2021. He also teaches at the Open University in the UK. To start our event, I'll pass the mic to David Roden.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks so much, Seti, and thanks to everyone for turning up to talk about this strange little book. I mean, in a way, Snuff Memories is an unintroducible book because it doesn't really belong to any clearly defined genre, as Seti's gloss points out. It transects a number of different genres, different styles of writing. So I guess maybe I'll begin by saying a bit about its genesis before I launch into a reading, and then we can launch into the panels. Shortly after I wrote Posthuman Life, Philosophy at the Edge of the Human, for various reasons, I started experimenting with different kinds of writing, different kinds of philosophical text, including some work for the 9th Berlin Biennale, which really got me interested again in incorporating fiction or elements, if you like, modules of fiction and prose poetry and abstract prose within my work. I mean, we can talk later about the extent to which that trajectory kind of comes out of my more straight philosophical work. But Snuff Memories really derives from an attempt to do that on a bigger scale than before. And in a sense, the problems I'm addressing in Snuff Memories are in part problems of form. They're problems of how you, in a sense, incorporate these diverse modules within some kind of within some kind of recognizable, cohesive text without making it too cohesive. Okay, so first reading, I'm going to start with one of the more kind of straightforward narrative passages, which crops up at the in the middle of the book, where the narrator, who's a kind of I guess a sort of hermaphrodite time traveler from the future, has been imprisoned in an ancient palace full of kind of weird technologies by some kind of military caste. So anyway, here's a passage from the palace. During the march to my ablutions, I notice that most of the alcoves are empty, but in a few I can see the other pilot things waiting patiently for our exercise and wash. I have little interest in the bodies of others, exo, endo. Our Q phases are already too many to count. Yet at our meetings, I relish seeing Evgenia coated in wriggling multi-legged things, each a cupcake son of yellow mandibles. The legs sutured her arms, the mandibles unfurled her belly and pubis like paper sculptures. As her body tore and bloomed, she or the rat spoke in a calm, measured way, as if dictating a deed for refractory appellants. Then, impassioned, they burst out of casements, oily in blood and sentiment. She calmed them, itself, with faltering caresses. I buzzed then with anomalous Q memories, the jetsams of past or futures I could not own, as she queried. What are the N and Q dimensions of the spike? Describe the air quality and mood on the island. Who is the dirty rep? Who or what is contained in the blocks? Above us, the vast dome billowed out in clouds of torn and ruptured matter, the blackened bodies of posits and priests suspended in a canopy of curling spiral thorns, a vastness occluded in vapor from the floor, as if from an internal explosion, rivulets of the same oily material scabbed around the rents in visible areas of wall and dome, now reinforced by sheets of hard syndic steel. Evgenia had now entirely unzipped. Her pale head with its shining dark hair was supported on a long strand of Karakali egg sacs. What could I tell her about the island? I didn't understand the spike, had never been that inland for all that might have achieved. Otherwise, I was candid and loquacious enough. I told the satrap she would die very soon, that the identity of the rep was of no importance, above all to itself. Perhaps she thought that she could preempt or even forestall your existence. When asked how I knew she would die, I said that I had dreamt it, a convenient alibi, for as is often the case, I knew without knowing how I knew. She had resumed half her human shape at that point, and I noticed her smiling unselfconsciously, touching some exposed area of dark skin below her throat. To her side, the big shaven-headed man I know as Behemoth shifted uncomfortably. After the interrogation, Behemoth rolled my trolley along the concourse, which swarmed with technicians, syndic guards, and clocks, to a forest of prefabricated toilet cubicles to the edge of the dome, then stripped and showered me himself. Two clocks gripped me in black claws either side, holding me up as the high-pressure jets enfiladed my skin. Each guard caged a complete skeleton of its former occupant, bonded to its chassis by micro-commissures that allowed the Kit F soldiers a partial control of their exoskeleton in life. Compared to Behemoth, they were oddly circumspect and gentle. He couldn't get enough of me, something about the juxtaposition of my belly slit and my exaggerated testicles, my winsome mood face, my liquid indetermination, I don't know. After the shower, he would give me a rough rectal examination while massaging my prostate and cock until I came screaming in his mouth. Then he would kneel and rest his gleaming domed head between my thighs, reeling off prayers to forgotten saints or gods he might have learned at kindergarten. Sometimes he would run his fingers tentatively around my slit, fascinated by the way the serif code cut across the concentric ridges of skin around it. He'd look into its sparkling blackness, fascinated but unwilling to place his hand there, despite my repeated promises not to eat him.
Thank you, David, for that fascinating reading. I'll introduce our first guest, Amanda Beech. Amanda Beech is an artist and writer. Her work poses questions and propositions for what a realist art can be in today's culture. That is, a work that can articulate a comprehension of reality without the terminal mirror of a human identity that is used to picture it. Beech has shown her artwork internationally, including Cause and Effect, Arte Combi Gallery, Verona, Italy. This time, a video commission for the Remai Modern, Canada, Covenant Transport, Move or Die at the Baltic Centre for Contemporary Art, UK. What Hope Looks Like After Hope, Homework 7, Beirut City Forum, Ashkal Alwan, Beirut, Lebanon. And she has presented work at the Irish and Montreal Biennales. She is a contributing editor of Construction Site for Possible Worlds 2020 and Cold War, Cold World 2016, Urbanomic, and other writing has included Notes on Art and its Science, Speculative Aesthetics 2016, and Death of Horror, Diseases of the Head 2020, and many more. Beech is Dean of Critical Studies at California Institute of the Arts. And with that, I'll pass the mic to Amanda Beech.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks for the invite. And it's great to share this great panel. And thanks, David, for the book, which makes us be here, together. And I did something that I consider to be pretty uncool, which is I wrote out my question because I know that we were asked to speak for like 5-10 minutes or something. And I thought, I'll write it out because then I can kind of get my head around what I want to say or what I'm trying to think. And also I had my COVID vaccination yesterday and I was a bit worried that I might not be very well. So they're all the reasons why I'm like a bit nerdy, I guess, in writing something out rather than being kind of impromptu and spontaneous. So I'll just go to that. And also, David, I think it does speak, what I'm trying to think about does speak to this question of genre that you brought up already. So I hope that we can kind of get to that a little bit more. Okay, so I just want to talk about snuff itself for a minute, and in terms of what I think about it as like a structural condition, let's say. And also, just also when one responds to people's work, I fully understand, because it's happened to me, I've been on the other end of this, and I also fully understand that, people reading your work, like, i.e., like giving a reading of an interpretation of it, might have missed things, might have missed parts of the piece, might be going off on another track. So I just also fully accept that that is absolutely likely to happen in these responses as well. So there might be like misdirections and things in my response. So for me, when I think about snuff, it's a paradoxical theatre of actuality. And it's the organisation and performance of pain that is real. In this, it's a dimension of the genre of horror, but unlike horror, which operates by threatening to collapse the dialectical distinction between artifice and reality, and which therefore maintains some order between them, snuff collapses artifice and life and makes us feel that all is real, that it is not staged. And snuff does this by intimidating reason in excess of horror. This structure has consequences for the political. The theatrical framing of real oppression functions as a form of insurance against having to commit to the possibility that pain is actually happening in the world. If the pain of others is staged, it is somehow consensual, but also therefore unreal, and we can keep watching. At the same time, this pain has to be understood as real. It is a fact that pain and suffering is happening in front of us. But seeing this pain as real does not bring us to any kind of social empathy that recognizes the pain of others. Instead, the consolidated identicality of being an image brings us the kinds of ecstatic pleasure of a Judeo-Christian theological dimension, one which I know kind of is cultivated in the book. This violence of snuff, therefore, is bracketed as a private experience in the mind. But at the same time, we know that this structure manifests as social and public. It does so as dominance and violence because snuff bars access to the space of agreements that subtend its images. In Snuff Memories, I think both what we see is a theatre and pain as real. The theatre, the constructed image and the frame for bodies, is now an entangled part of a visceral material and a systematized reality. Both body and image are a secularized and ritualized economy that is bound to the world, just as other myths and legends are, other ritual spaces. Pain as lived is endless, and its value is material. But these relations, I don't think they're collapsed together in the kinds of ways that we see life and theatre being collapsed in, say, the pornographic media of today's reality TV show celebrity culture. But also at the same time, the relation of the image and reality in Snuff Memories is not held apart. It's not constructed in the modern sense of the horror genre, where reality is exposed at the edges of the image, at the limits of reason, as a kind of violence that penetrates the illusion of what is given to knowledge. So I don't think that the kind of operations of image and reality are working in either of those kind of conditions. Instead, I think that the tension, if we can say there is one, is created in the ways things are described in time and space. So what I see in the aesthetics of the book is how complex abstract assemblages made of self-consciously selected words and phrases prevent conventional disjunctions, as well as prevents the satisfaction of conjunctions between how something is described and what it is. And contestations are established inside and between sentences, phrases, paragraphs, and episodes. Pictures are constituted in a cloying assemblage of focus details and close-ups, blurred, dark establishing shots, but also a blurring of space where we move registers of information. There is a lot of zooming in and zooming out in fragments of concentration, but also at the same time, a line is followed in one-dimensional time. These sensible expressions of various antagonized materialities don't stop at the body. Pictures of industry, docks, and the colonial commerce of the customs house are interwoven with cultic, sacral, and religious structures. They are all depicted as operational relics, props out of time, but still in the mix of things. They are spaces that act as hubs and stages for interactions and performative, parodic sex acts, where sex as materiality is not sensuous, really, but rather spectacular and displayed, inverted and exposed. It is not equal to empathy, friendship, or love, but as another violent transaction of plugging in. These events and spaces continue to define the routinization of capitalistic energy as a slow beast that, like the Sardian body, has its own infinite mortality that drags on. In many ways, then, I would say that the book explicates the structure of snuff. And in doing this, the text conjures many stylistic and theoretical references. For me, it invokes the claustrophobia of the 17th century Baroque, the medievalism of Arcady and Boris Strugatsky's book, Hard to Be a God, the immersive nightmares of modernity synonymous with Hermann Hesse, as well as Ernst Junger's theory and fictions that witness the annihilation of self in a charismatic violence of society and technology as a form of nature, but also the surrealism of Roger Caillois's psychasthenics. But this text does not offer a stoic Jungerian hero that sacrifices himself to the violence of technology as a surrender to the real, and means to overcome the inalienation of the individual and abstract technological social forces that oppress that subject. Rather, this is a life that refuses the dialectic of life and mortality. Finitude exists, but its meaning is conditioned upon a specific allocation of humanity is extinct. So this binding of humans to the technological and capital persists in the book. And when I was reading it, a picture from Terminator 2, My World, Judgment Day comes to mind. And in that film, you've got Miles Dyson about to blow himself up, as well as a microprocessor, his life's work, that would lead to the future of sentient machines and the annihilation of the human. To know the future, to believe that his invention establishes this horror, means that to prevent it, he must also die. In this moment, a contract is written between human and technology that binds them in life and in death. So Miles Dyson's sacrifice in Terminator 2 is not the end of this relation. Instead, it's the binding of it and the guarantee for a future where these forces are no longer irreducible. So together, this talk of aesthetics, as well as the histories and ideas that they are attached to, remind me of how the real is a form of the technological sublime, and the alienation of human consciousness has been imaged by narratives of the human becoming inhuman and or evolving into a non-human technologized species across theory and literature. These have moreover narrated the inability for the human to intervene within the relations of human life, reason and capital, and like Terminator, speak to fate and evolution. These spaces risk forgetting the real altogether, either reinforcing the structure of snuff and its violence, or by realizing a post-snuff world completely dominated by a theology that contains a new species of slavery. Meaning is evacuated, non-representationalist forms dismantle the frame, all is equally unreal, and we are left with oppression as a form of nature in pseudo-theological proto-fascist systems. So in all of this, my first question, I think, is a question, maybe a simple question, and one that you've spoken to a little bit already, David, which is where the text comes from, what it's made of from times beyond itself. And in my little talk here, I've tried to describe snuff as dialectical and as a non-representational structure, a kind of world of snuff, but also a world of post-snuff, if you like. And both have a very specific aesthetic tropes, and they mean different things. And I'm interested in how the book draws from these structures and images, and depending on what it's structured from, depending what you think, how you think it works through and possibly against them. So basically, what, if any, is the conversation with these kinds of histories and aesthetics that bind an aesthetics of the non-human or the human under duress to the field of social oppression that gives the real over to capital? And I think that question that is about like what kind of supports the book, let's say, also allows me to ask a question about what goes on inside the book, because I spent some time describing the inside of the book in a kind of aesthetic sense, not a narrative sense, but like more about the constructed aesthetics of the book. And one of the things that stood out for me is a question of like the irreversible process of time, which I saw, and you might disagree with me, this is where, you know, you might say, no, Amanda, you've kind of got that wrong. But when I was thinking about this evocation of planetary death, for example, but also the passing of time in a linear sense seen in the relics of capital that like litter the book, because that indicates a kind of evolutionary space of a different kind. So I'm wondering if this scientific, like planetary geoscale of finitude for you or anyone else, like would enable a kind of intervention in the space of snuff, the one that seems to be kind of infinite and entangled. And I'm asking this because the book does offer, for me anyway, differentiated modes of the finite and the infinite, the mortality of the planet, the infinite capacities obtained in time travel, as well as the one-dimensional time of historic capital. So I'm wondering how these multiple frames and multiple temporalities speak to a diagnosis of the political today, but also might gesture beyond that. So if the book manifests like a dialectic between a mortal planet and infinite oppression, if it does that, you know, you might disagree, then if it does, what grounds does the book play in? What are the grounds? So I think both my questions really are trying to ask questions about the given, but also the real. And just to say, like, coming from this as an artist myself, in all of this, my real interest is how the practice of writing and the aesthetics that it produces determines new, but also connects to given systems of thought. As we know, fiction, like anything else, is not a free space. So I'm wondering about, like, both my questions are trying to get at this idea of what determined and determining trajectories permit the contestation of time and space as given, as well as could produce counterfactuals in the space of fiction that turn out possibly to have traction on the reality that we are in now, today. So David, you know, whenever you're ready, I don't know how we're going to do this today, but any of those things, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, or anyone else, in fact, because they're just, like I say, questions from me that kind of come to my practice, I guess, as much as would I see in yours. So thanks for listening.
Oh, thank you, Amanda. That's amazing. I'm just, this is just really one for Seti. I mean, I could begin to respond now, and then we could go on to Simon, or would that
that works, David, if you want to take a moment to respond, and then we can move to Simon. Or
yeah, okay, maybe a short response now, and we can kind of draw together things later. So yeah, so excuse the brevity of this. I mean, I think I guess one way of thinking about the book in terms of the real, you know, in terms of a kind of construction of the real is might go via J.G. Ballard's phrase, ontology of violence. I think he uses it in the Atrocity Exhibition. So in a sense, I think the world that I'm trying to, I mean, there's a sense, I think, in which Snuff Memories isn't trying, it's not, it's one way in which generically it departs, say, from science fiction, is that it's not about world building in the conventional sense. I'm not, in a sense, I mean, there is a kind of narrative here, but I wanted the joy, I wanted the links between the elements to be, in a sense, apparent, as it were, on the page. So, as I was saying earlier, there are a kind of multitude of modules or vectors, some of which are working independently, in the sense they have their own kind of immanent sort of pulse or becoming that are repeated throughout the work. So in a way, it's not a book, if it's a book about the kind of imagistic violence or the kind of way capitalism immerses us in an ontology of violence, it's not a violence of spectacle or images, it's a kind of violence of kind of tendencies or powers, I think, which transect the various bodies that are associated with it. So in a way, it's you could read it perhaps as a way of trying to burrow beneath the kind of spectacle or the theatre that kind of contemporary capitalism, contemporary media kind of present us with. And maybe that's, you know, giving it more of a kind of political, critical reading than I intended, but that's probably no bad thing. But I mean, maybe we could come back to this. You know, that's I realize it's a very kind of tentative response to an extremely complex, layered set of questions, Amanda. Thank you for that.
Thank you, David, for the response. And thank you, Amanda, for your contribution. We'll move to our next panelist, Simon Sellars. Simon Sellars is a writer and editor. His latest book is Applied Ballardianism, Memoir from a Parallel Universe, Urbanomic, 2018, described by The Guardian as a brilliantly written genre mashup, a wonderfully original mix of cultural theory, literary exegesis, travelogue, and psychopathological memoir. He lives in Melbourne, Australia. Simon?
Thank you for having me. Thanks, David, for inviting me, and it's good to be here. So I really loved Snuff Memories. I thought it was a great experience, and I'm just going to present a few sort of fragmented thoughts on my impressions of the book, which I think sort of fits the sort of fragmented nature of the text itself, and talking a bit about that. So I think for me, the first thing to say is I had a bit of a love-hate relationship when I started to read Snuff Memories. And I think this has nothing to do with the book or with David. It was to do with this sort of eroded attention span I've had lately, being in this sort of COVID crisis mode. You know, the book is not an easy read, and I've been doing a bit of comfort reading lately. And so I found myself, as I was reading the book, trying to find the storyline in it and the narrative, which is, of course, is completely the wrong approach for something like this, and is not my normal sort of reading mode. But in the end, I let the book sort of wash over me like a fever dream. And that's how it sort of came to me in the end. And, you know, the book is a surreal reading experience. It's frightening at times, and it's shot through with this eroticism. And so in the end, I sort of submitted to what the text was doing. And yeah, it began to wash over me like this sort of fever dream. The structure of the thing, written in these sort of fragments or flashes or vignettes and this fractured language at times, seemed like to me like the consciousness of a dying brain at first, trying to piece together a life, or someone maybe consumed by media, crosshatched with signals, so that in the end their body dissolves in the wake of that. And so that feeling began to speak to me the more I read the text and the more I was piecing these elements together. And I began to notice the influences coming through. And to me, the first really strong influence, or the strong sort of textual underlay I detected, was the sort of Cronenberg influence of body horror. And, you know, this is obviously directly referenced in Snuff Memories. There's references to Videodrome, and there's references to the character Brian Oblivion from Videodrome as well, who also seems to now be a character in Snuff Memories. And so for anyone who's seen Videodrome, it's about people being invaded by technological signals and media signals, and their body mutating in strange new ways. And so I was really intrigued by the way this has been worked into the text, and the way that sort of those sort of characters have now become characters in David's parallel universe. But there's also this, you know, I think it's fair to say there's a strong Ballardian influence in there from Ballard, and David mentioned Ballard earlier, and I've seen in other interviews where David has referred to himself as an infant Ballardian. And so that was, I thought that was an interesting undercurrent throughout as well. And there's, I think, you know, something like Crash, I can sort of detect a sort of parallel with the approaches here, because I've always seen Ballard's Crash as this sort of treatise on a sort of proto-posthumanism, or a sort of primitive posthumanism, where just by the simple act of driving a car, we're becoming, you know, in a very obvious way, merging with the machine, going into this automatic mode of driving and so on, and allowing the machine to take over. And of course, in Crash, this sort of merger becomes very bloody. It's not a sort of clinical, beautiful or transcendental posthumanism. It's very bloody, ripping apart of the body and so on, similar to what happens in Videodrome and Cronenberg's films. And of course, you know, Snuff Memories is very visceral as well, very bloody in the way that it seems to me like one species is becoming another species, or a sort of uplifting of a species, and the invasion of the body by these metallic tentacles. But I think also Ballard's Atrocity Exhibition is another interesting reference that could be brought to bear on David's text. Because in Atrocity Exhibition, it's a similar sort of I guess, as a formal structure of these vignettes that come at you like these sort of washes of a very disembodied consciousness or whatever. But the characters in that are very mediated subjects. They're defined by the media landscape and so saturated by it that in the end they can't see beyond it. So the media landscape for those characters becomes this sort of augmented reality in which the primacy of their bodies is dissolved into the poet's signal. And so Ballard's text is to depict that is anatomical, very clinical and forensical descriptions of the body and the body being pulled apart and put back together, which I see operating in David's text as well, and beautifully done in David's text as well. And so the text that I think in both Atrocity Exhibition and Snuff Memories, it sort of circles in on itself, refers to past lives and future lives, and seems to combine all of these things into this circular loop of references. And I don't sort of mean to devalue Snuff Memories by sort of dwelling a bit on the influences, but rather in pointing out how they're sort of repurposed in new ways, almost like David has sampled them and reworked them into his narrative. And I mentioned that Brian Oblivion character earlier from Videodrome. It's as if Oblivion has wandered into some parallel universe, just like Ronald Reagan does in Atrocity Exhibition. It seems to say that because of their sort of overwhelming ubiquity in the popular consciousness, they sort of belong to us now in our imagination, and we can do to them whatever we please. And there's a beautiful passage from David's book, which I just wanted to read out, which I think sort of sums up these sort of themes, but also demonstrates how I think David refers back to those Ballard texts. And the passage is, Belmer's mannequin, too sexual and domesticated, cedes to the mesh's combinatory power. Crash decor, dead machines, blackened leg stances at forgotten airports, ruptured genitalia, wash evening embankments, an anagram we appeased following a regulative principle. And so in that short passage, there's a lot of, it's very densely packed. You could almost unpack each of those sentences and create separate paragraphs from those. So I think that's the sort of power of what David is doing here, is compressing all of these sort of very densely packed references into a few frames. And has this cumulative effect of everything happening at once and breaking down at once and reforming at once. And as I was reading, I was reminded of the William Basinski series of albums, Disintegration Loops, where Basinski plays a tape over and over. And each time it passes the tape head, it gets slightly degraded and erased, but there's always the original tape underneath it all, undermining the sort of structural integrity. And I couldn't help thinking of that process as I was reading David's book. So there's always these sort of trace elements underneath that keep rising to the surface. And I started to wonder if Snuff Memories could be read in any order. So there's various subheadings that David has peppered throughout the book. They're not numbered. They could loop in on themselves. There's always this constant reference to past concepts and characters' thoughts and identities and scenarios. And I started to think that reading it backwards with the last vignette to the first would equally as well, or even starting in the middle. And so I wonder if David approached the writing of the text that way. Surely he didn't sit down and block out scenes and character maps. I find that idea kind of ludicrous, or maybe he did. So I guess my first question to David would be, could you talk a little bit about the process by which the novel came about, if something so mysterious can be pinned down and identified? Was it perhaps a process of dreaming awake rather than plotting and planning a scenario? And perhaps related to that, I wonder if David could talk a bit about the way his work, the influences into the text, and what you, David, see as the purpose of that. But there was something else working away for me as I read the book. I've long been interested in the sort of literature of alien abduction. So both in science fiction and in so-called witness testimonies from people who claim to have undergone this. And what I kept thinking of is that image of aliens administering invasive bodily probes that you find in that kind of writing and testimony. And I wonder if in the end, Snuff Memories could be read as the tale of an uplifted species saying goodbye to its old form, a species progressing to the next level with the help of technological, i.e. alien intervention. And for me, there are a lot of resonances with that literature, that body of literature of alien abduction and Snuff Memories. You know, there's the secret rooms where grotesque physical experiments take place. You find that in both sets of work. The mysterious figures that are given names in alien abduction accounts, like the Greys or the Tools or the Nordics. And in David's book, you know, these mysterious shadowy figures have names like Clocks and the Behemoth and so on. And so this all chimes in with stories of alien abduction in which the witnesses give their captors these odd names that seem to relate to some inscrutable aspect of their personality or physical appearance. So while on one level I read this text as that Ballardian / Cronenbergian examination of the new flesh and the eruption and mutation of the new flesh, this body horror inextricable from eroticism and desire. On the other hand, I can't help but think it's also this fantastic addition to the lore of alien abduction, and by alien could be read anyway, metaphorical or literally or whatever. And so what's so intriguing about that reading for me is that alien abduction in those accounts, in those witness accounts and the way they're reported, it's always charged with this sexual ambiguity. So the abductees fear these monsters and they succumb to their ministrations, in some cases experiencing sexual ecstasy despite the horror of the scenario. So for me, these tales of alien abduction have always held this underlying sadomasochistic undertow that's always repressed by those who report on it or claim to experience it. But that seems to be highlighted and brought to the surface and foregrounded in Snuff Memories. So my final question to David is, have you been abducted by aliens? Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, shall I respond a bit now and then we can just, yeah, I mean, no, I haven't actually considered the literature on alien abduction, but I guess that may have been, you know, all the sort of folklore about rectal probes and the like was probably kind of burrowing away somewhere in my unconscious. Actually, how this book came together is still mysterious to me, if I'm honest. I mean, I've worked on it for approximately 2 years on and off, you know, between other writing projects. I think until summer, lockdown summer, basically, I wasn't sure whether it would come together. I mean, it seemed, you know, it's of the nature of this kind of text that at any moment it seems to be coming apart like wet tissue paper, you know, because in a sense the lineaments, the tendons, the prints of the, you know, it's a text which kind of, in a sense, it only works if it kind of fabricates itself in the mind of the writer. I mean, in terms of the kind, and this kind of reference refers back to Amanda's question as well. I think you're absolutely right, of course, about the Ballardian influences, particularly Crash and the Atrocity exhibition. I think Crash is a proto-posthuman work insofar as it kind of explores not merely our relationship to technology, but our investment in it, our erotic and libidinal investment, and the way that is in itself overlaid with metaphor and discourse and sexual imagery. And I think that's what's so brilliant about Ballard's book, that in a sense it tries to imagine the mid-20th century as the emergence of a new technological life form, rather than, you know, and in a way that I think could never be done through kind of a realist narrative. And that speaks to me in terms of my work on posthumanism, because in a sense the problem that that my work on speculative posthumanism bequeathed me is how to devise a posthuman ethics or a posthuman politics, given that the frame within which it operates is in a sense maximally large and maximally void or empty. You know, because the constraints are kind of wide open. It's like, to use the kind of synthesis metaphor, it's like, you know, you've opened the filters on your synthesizer and just the raw kind of signal is coming, raw noise is coming through. And how do you kind of find locations or trajectories through that? So, and one way to think about that is the body in extremis, the body in a kind of where the erotic frame is sort of maximally unbound, where in a sense the genre of stuff reduces the body to a sort of bare kind of larval tendency that's sort of open to an undefined future. So it's if you like it's a time unburdened by intentionality or purpose or any kind of ethical map. But I'll stop here so we can carry on, move on to Corey. But thanks so much, Simon. That's brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Simon, for sharing your thoughts. Go to our next guest, Corey McCall. Corey McCall is an instructor of philosophy for the Cornell Prison Education Program and a visiting scholar at Penn State's Humanities Institute. His research examines connections between philosophy, art, and politics across various American, African American, and Afro-Caribbean traditions. His recent and forthcoming publications include the co-edited volume, Decolonizing American Philosophy, SUNY 2021. Misinterpreted Monsters, co-authored with Borna Rotnick for Curializing Frankenstein, Rowman and Littlefield 2021, and Rethinking Oedipus, Foucault and Deleuze on Knowing, Forgetting, and Fractured Selves, for The Politics of Desire, Foucault, Deleuze, and Psychoanalysis, Rowman and Littlefield 2022. Passing the mic to Corey.
Okay, thank you, Seti. Thank you for an Objekt for hosting this, and thanks for the invite, and thanks, David, for writing this really interesting and provocative book. What I decided to do with my time is reflect a bit on what I saw as the theological remnants in Snuff Memories. And my reflections on the theological dimension or remains were sort of prompted by my initial confusion about how to make sense of the book, right? So my sort of guiding or overarching question was, what am I or what are we to make of this book? And I mean to pose this question in at least two senses. First, to register the confusion I felt and in many ways still feel when confronted with this text: who, what, when, where. Similar, I think, to the confusion we feel when confronted with Samuel Beckett or William S. Burroughs or Georges Bataille for the first time. This initial confusion was somewhat alleviated by reading what David and others have written about Snuff Memories, but it didn't disappear altogether. In some sense, the confusion, I think, is the point. We're also in the position of the misshapen and malformed creatures that populate this text. But I believe there's something more to this question, what are we to make of this book, than the registering of my initial befuddlement at David's provocative text. The question, what are we to make of this book, echoes the declaration of the first line of Snuff Memories. You were always defined by results. To be always defined by results provides one way of answering this question, what are we to make of this? We'll understand what to make of this if we judge whatever it is by its results. We shall know you not by your fruits, but rather by your results. And of course, here I'm contrasting the declaration found in Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 through 20, with the opening line of Snuff Memories. These verses begin with a warning followed by the declaration that we shall know them by their fruits. So quoting now, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they're ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits, you will know them. End quote. Beware of false prophets, warns the gospel before explaining how we can distinguish the false prophet from the true one. But we should be careful here, although they bear some preliminary resemblances to one another. We shouldn't be too quick to equate fruits with results. The world of the Christian Gospels is a world like our own that seeks to carefully distinguish true from false, the authentic from the inauthentic, an all too human world, in other words. Snuff Memories, I think, presents us with another world, a post-human world in which we who cling so desperately to the distinction between the true and the false, the authentic and the inauthentic, and even the human and inhuman, are little more than a dim memory. Here's how David himself characterizes Snuff Dreams in a recent blog post. Quote, Snuff Memories. I don't know why I got the title wrong. Snuff Memories, which might be termed a novel of speculative eroticism, effectuates this subtractive desire, a desire nonetheless distended by the pervasive magnetism of things to come and their iterated catastrophes. Not only personal death, but ecological death, the death of the sun, and extending this Platonic motif of all solar transcendence. This book is a montage of texts, genres, and perspectives, alternating between the subtractive eroticism of death-driven biomorphic bodies and the disindividuating mesh of all the alienating moral powers haunting its ancient, demon-haunted cosmos, technological, alien, theological. So, beginning with my opening contrast between the Gospel's fruits and Snuff Memories' results, I'm interested in tracing some of the threads of the theological remains in David's novel of speculative eroticism. So we might begin by characterizing the theological dimension of the ruined landscape found in Snuff Memories as antinomian. On this reading, posthumanism would be antinomian, or at least would express itself in the ruins of an antinomian desire. In a religious or a theological sense, antinomianism designates those religious leaders and sects that break from the established laws or norms of a religious sect to which they belong. Hence, all Promethean projects could be considered antinomian, although Promethean projects can take religious or secular form, a theme that's long fascinated writers. We could cite Mary Shelley's Frankenstein here, for example. From the standpoint of orthodoxy, these antinomian prophets would be false, and Matthew would warn us that we should pay careful attention to their fruits. In various Christian traditions, then, antinomianism designates those individuals and groups who, thanks to divine grace, thought themselves beyond the reach of the religious strictures that governed those who weren't among the elect. So we have a conflict between two individuals or groups that both of whom think themselves to be the true, the ones graced by God. Oh, and I also found Ryan Reeves' definition of antinomianism amusing. I think this is on a website, sort of an evangelical website or something, but writing on a site called the Gospel Coalition, Reeves characterizes antinomians as being those who preach sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So on that definition, we might all be antinomians. Well, I don't know that I completely agree with Reeves's characterization. It's at least memorable. Various characters in Snuff Memories recall these Promethean makers, but these are just dimly remembered fragments. We get hints of this antinomian Prometheans of this ruined world, that there's no sense they'll be held accountable for what they've done, or even that a clear account of how they were responsible can be given. Consider this passage from page 41, quote, "They're carving out their itineraries unsoundly. What remains will be less like a body, more a procedure for compression and future proofing. The object is a facile corollary of the subject that was or will be, and a kind of bootstrapping lure disassembles us as we look away. The Prometheans believe themselves disabused, but now carry the God they made along the nomad trails at the margins of the broken, a scarred, sterile waste around wise monumental ruin. Latterly, the rationalists had become penitents and plague spreaders. Whatever happened to this ruined world, the Prometheans had a role in it." And also just briefly drawing attention to the bottom of page 93 over to 94, the reference to the proms, the putative God makers. How could the proms, putative God makers, not know they'd crossed an ageless theological divide? The rose or Deus absconditus gives life unconditionally. So while there are certainly resonances between Prometheanism and, posthumanism and antinomianism, the antinomian impulse flourishes within a context of an established order and orthodoxy, a clearly defined moral and political order of some kind. The shock of antinomianism can only be felt where order reigns. The antinomian prophet flouts this order. If there were antinomian tendencies within posthumanism, they must have flourished long before the events depicted in Snuff Memories. Perhaps it'd be better to say then that Snuff Memories depicts a post-human Gnostic world, but I don't think that's quite right either. Gnosticism claims that this fallen world was created by a single evil demiurge, and that we might, through knowledge and spiritual discipline, come to know the one true God. The problem is that there is no one true God behind the demiurge in this post-human world of becoming without death. The things that populate this world seek only pleasure and the ultimate release of death. The final release of death rarely comes, however. Instead, it's the reconfiguration in a new temporary form of becoming that will yield different results, but no fruits. For the ripening of fruits entails a teleology, and behind the ripening fruit, a whole metaphysics of time that sees time in terms of progress. Christian eschatology posits an end time when the true and the false will be clearly distinguished and all will be made known. Snuff Memories' post-human timescape posits no progress toward an eschaton. Instead, the eschaton or the apocalypse has already occurred, long in the past and dimly remembered by these post-human things who continue to cling to something akin to life. Indeed, something akin to eternal life without the promise of death. So I want to conclude with a final comparison, this time from Kafka. In one of his more memorable sketches, Kafka presents us with a thing named Objekt. Kafka's sketch begins with a reflection on the etymology of this thing's strange name before turning to the thing itself. Quote, "It looks at first like a flat, star-shaped spool for thread, and it does appear to be wound with thread, but it's not only a spool. A little rod sticks out crosswise from the middle of the star, and another one's fitted into this rod at a right angle. With the aid of this little rod on one side and one of the rays on the other, the whole thing can stand upright as if on two legs." We're told that we might be tempted, at least initially, to believe that Objekt is simply a broken thing. But this initial assumption proves false. For it doesn't appear that the useless thing is broken at all. It speaks, though you only ask it simple questions like those you would ask a child, and it responds simply like a child when it chooses to respond, which is only rarely. I was reminded of Kafka's thing, Objekt, when reading Snuff Memories because of the final lines of his sketch, that is of Kafka's sketch, narrated by the patriarch of the house. It's called The Cares of a Family Man or The Cares of a Patriarch. Narrated by the patriarch of the house where Objekt dwells. Quote, "In vain I ask myself, what will become of him? Is it possible for him to die? Everything that dies has some sort of prior purpose, some sort of occupation, and has worn itself to nothing doing it. And that does not apply to Objekt. So will he one day tumble down the stairs, perhaps under the feet of my children or grandchildren, trailing his threads after him? He obviously does no harm to anyone, but the idea that he should still outlive me does almost give me pain, end quote. The narrator of this short story is a patriarch, a Hausvater, who's discovered this strange thing in his home. The cares of the patriarchs, the creators, the Prometheans who made Snuff Memories, a world of ruin, remain unfathomable, and the things that live after them aren't completely useless. They're defined by results, though these results are not purposes, and they're certainly not final. So thank you.
Corey, it's brilliant. I guess maybe what I'll do is kind of respond, and then we can have another reading and then go into the segue into the last two papers. Okay, so yeah, thank you, Corey. Again, once again, it's just a completely novel and unexpected angle on the book. I mean, in a way, I understand your bemusement and befuddlement in the face of this text, because in a sense I share it. You know, I mean, well, I've written this thing, but I mean, precisely how I wrote it is still a little obscure and opaque to me. And I guess, but I think you've seized on something essential, which is, if you like, the role of teleology and the role of bodies, kind of finite, bounded existence or finitude within the book. That's certainly a preoccupation, and I was thinking about the kind of metaphysics of normativity or value, if anything, operating in this book. It's certainly it's certainly not a traditional theological universe where there's some kind of transcendent authority laying down and assigning purposes and order and meaning to things, and yet it's not entirely a world without. It's not. I think I quip somewhere that, you know, kind of nihilism is, in a sense, almost something to be an object of nostalgia in a sense in this world as well, because it's not that there's no purpose, there's just too bloody much of it. It's kind of rotten with purpose. I mean, with my philosopher's hat on, one way of thinking about this might be as an extreme implication of some kind of anti-naturalistic normativism. I mean, if you think that norms or values can't be reduced to anything natural, that they're conceptually irreducible, then there's no reason, in principle, why norms shouldn't arise anywhere through all sorts of obscure and opaque mechanisms, not just in human societies. You know, so some panpsychists argue that, you know, there's an inherent normativity in the sort of intrinsic properties of reality due to the qualia there, or whatever, you know. So it's kind of a world of wild normativity. The reference to Prometheanism is somewhat mischievous, because there's kind of a sort of, you know, within the sort of tiny niche that kind of Twitter fanatics and bloggers that talk about this stuff, there's a kind of fissure between a kind of broadly rationalist wing of posthumanism, if you want to call it that. I guess it would be characterized by people like Reza Negrestani or Ray Brassier, who argue that, you know, there can be some kind of immanent normativity that's produced through collective human reasoning, if you like, through the cultivation of collective intelligence, and a kind of more libidinal wing influenced by Deleuze and Lyotard, and I mean, I'm not sure, you know, I mean, I'm not sure where I stand here. I'm probably more on the libidinal wing, but I kind of like the idea that I was interested in the idea, and I am interested in the idea that even the immanent cultivation of reason through the giving and asking for reason through social discourse, in a sense, is dependent on multitudes of factors, which in a sense can deflect or undermine that project, which is so I kind of, you know, there was something amusing in the idea that a kind of rationalist project would become ultimately a sort of a form of self-lacerating religion. That, to be honest, that doesn't begin to do justice to your reading, Corey, but it's just an observation, I guess. Just bringing. I think the Kafka reference is really beautiful, and it kind of I think it compresses certainly some of the points raised by Amanda as well, maybe in the idea that, you know, there's some kind of ontological insight into the sort of nature of finitude here, and particularly the sort of finitude that operates in a kind of planetary technological matrix, you know, which is somehow inherently incomplete. And yeah, even though we can die, you know, in some sense, that there's something in our kind of lack of, in the way the whole system itself lacks any kind of immanent teleology or purpose, which deprives us of which kind of, you know, snuffs us in advance. We're kind of deprived of that fullness of life to which we might aspire. So to some extent, we are, you know, in a sense, just being immersed in circuits of kind of planetary techno capital. We're kind of more like the Odradek than the patriarch. I guess, should we do another reading and then we can maybe get on with the next two panels? So I'm gonna. Okay, so I read from one of the kind of more straight narrative sections. I think I'm going to read from, I guess, one of the more kind of sort of free kind of poetic bits. So this is from the section called New Nature. And you can spot, I think the Ballardian references to terminal Beech will be fairly obvious to some. I failed on the beach, recapitulating hopeless circuits and sighs, uncertain what or where we were, what to say, heavy with solar flares, thirst, love, rat time. It isn't there, isn't the thing so much the thinging, doesn't clarify but drops from the sky as lazy stains, cherry bombs Sebastian as he pisses into sun, his pale all devouring and as resplendent as he. As his eyes close finally, he will see wet body parts in the sward around a temple frontage. A trivial contradiction or counterfactual can awaken this. It is too soon to call it by a name. For this reason, I'm drawn to those who abandon themselves without reserve to the fall. I respect her passion. I resent and decry it, a petty aporia. I act as if it were my own, something to politely apologize for, like my denuded presence here. Is this the only way I touch or approach you or Anna? In my self-deception, you are still a clown or trickster, ambiguous totem, unreadable, flickering like a spirit of the forest, the personification of cruelty, objective and necessary like that of our toe, nothing limited or human. Your permission to die is also a kind of metamorphosis when I jump from your tower. Nihilism is no longer our best or funniest trick, as if we ever had the freedom to withdraw and limit ourselves to such demands. Consider the alternative. Something hunts and cares for your pain. After our rescue from the matriarchal palace, I stayed on in Map's library, hoping to do it over, a kind of idolatry of all the traces she deposited in the suburban parks under the Oberpulse, algo-pended alerts. I sampled and generated and sliced her frequencies up beyond recognition and used them to vocode and transcode Obertura. She always wanted to think that we are not and do not think, have never lived, in hope the mesh circuitry will pass on. I do not know and cannot, in principle, know why her simulacra comfort me, and peace is an offer best rejected. Little wonder she hoped for even less, to remain garlanded among minimal things. Overexposed straw colour hair precipitately erased, head off at a bad angle, nose shatter marks of fall where, weakened by the trivial imperatives and intimacies, her body exposed her, not communally, not even alone. It is written, not shared, thinner than a screen, eluding the mirror in this photograph, which instead of her body communicates a gentle wind to the viewer, the black ghost of a hand piercing the fabric of the present in soft ash, serif code. It doesn't matter if we were condemned on spurious grounds, as if the charges are entirely in order, rape, child abuse, larceny. This is the fable of our self-conception, to be loved and guilty that we can be loved. So in those last days, we hunched on cold floors in black louvered rooms by Decasia's old garment quarter, sigils redacted from the matriarchy crypt or before projected onto a dust patterned in yellow. We would make it happen. Map wrote, an incipient cancer, the number of a power exceeds the infinite it disseminates undecidedly. It is the ruination of us. The mesh is undecidedly bigger than the world and cannot contain itself. It is, in consequence, there is no world. But it is not us. We air, ramify and cruise it. We make incompatibilities, blowbacks and portals. Make it blind, don't make it up. Your father saw black ships sluice a red door's proton skin, frolicking and sharp. He describes the first ribbons of the vitrines in the dark behind Jesus's blue-grey Terminator. We felt insidious love before an adoring pain filled us. We heard the Christ whisper, corrosive and sweet. I cannot easily recall what the syndic paralegals redacted, though we belong to these agents of our own effacement. No more connection with orienteering, bitter chocolate, rustic wines, cheap antiques. If they were ever there, she had emptied in ways that drew me on to Evgenia, wan oval face, framed in flashing dark hair, then you. Map's pensive corona remains, though. It is pathetic. Is it pathetic to want you as we mourn? Even asking this makes me sicken and ache for your next invitation to the house. So the rat, finally, it speaks, but it remembers less than we imagined, not because it fails to discern events, but because criteria are lacking for resemblance to occur. There's nothing here but to synth her up from snails, brown stains under ferns and statuary, in vasts where machines maturate mycelia, all the places once reserved for our asphyx games.
Thank you, David, for that reading, and thank you, Corey. I just want to remind our participants, if you have any questions, to type it in the chat and we'll read them. And we'll go to our next guest, Romina Weinberg. Romina Weinberg is a PhD candidate in Iberian and Latin American cultures at Stanford University. She holds a specialization in creative writing from Casa de Letras and a BA in modern literature and literary theory from the University of Buenos Aires, and a Master of Philosophy in Hispanic Studies from the University of Glasgow. Her research focuses on Latin American literature of the 19th through the 21st centuries, with a special emphasis on non-canonical, unorthodox, and weird fiction. Romina?
Thank you so much. Okay, so, wow. I was intimidated before, but now it's just, I am a mess. Okay, so I would like to start, and I love the fact that David called this like papers. This is definitely not a paper. Definitely not a paper. So I would just like to start my intervention by thanking Sepideh and David for the, to my mind, incredibly undeserved invitation. And so, I mean, I really gave this a thought, and I've come to terms with the fact that I am an incompetent reader of this text. So what I'm going to share with you is rather a personal and very succinct itinerary from my first encounter with speculative posthumanism to my first encounter with Snuff Memories, which I tie to my first reading of the Book of Questions, a short piece that I had the pleasure to translate into Spanish in December, and I am still working through it. I still don't fully grasp the meaning of the text, having translated it, and I think it's a wonderful challenge. And I'm going to share with you this itinerary because I think it reveals how poorly prepared I was and how poorly prepared I am still to understand what David is doing, which I think should have never been understood solely in terms of its contributions to philosophy. And I think what he's doing is really just a different creature, and that creature was already looming and already lurking in posthuman life. So very briefly, I was working on Latin American sci-fi and speculative posthumanism, and I remember emailing David like 5 years ago, posing really insufferable questions about what I used to call the sort of ethical aporias inherent in speculative posthumanism, and about the supposed contradiction between posthumanism's futuristic orientation and its commitment to dark phenomenology, among other really, I posed so many several questions, and I remember David taking the time of actually going like question by question, answering absolutely everything, but also noting and bringing to my attention that there were a few issues that were indeed inherent in speculative posthumanism and that should have remained and should still remain ambivalent and unresolved. And back then, I think I did understand where he was coming from, and now I'm beginning to understand the reasons why that should have been and should still be the case. So my only stop between posthuman life and Snuff Memories is just one stop. Fast forward to the publication of Intelligence and Spirit in 2018, and to Reza Negarestani's public responses to David. And I remember hearing Reza say in the context of a classroom, which was shared by no other than David, and that shows the extent to which he's the kindest interlocutor. And Reza was saying, and I'm quoting verbatim, and Reza already knows what I think, so this is not an accusation. So he was saying, speculation without epistemology and without dialectics is simply a vagary. Today, we call that whimsicality. If the future is uncertain, what kind of uncertainty are we talking about? Is it an uncertainty that we can epistemologically grasp, or is the shape of that uncertainty outside of the purview of our current epistemological frameworks? And then Reza goes on to say that if David thinks that the posthuman is outside of the purview of current epistemological capacities, equipment, frameworks, then there's absolutely nothing that we can say about the posthuman. And if the posthuman is within our grasp, then Reza says David is forced or was forced to provide an explication and a robust epistemological toolkit that would explain how we can get from this state of the art of technoscience to the emergence of posthumanity. And he should explain he should give some shape to the posthuman to come. And I think at that point, David had, first, needless to say, that David behaved elegantly and remained mostly silent, elegantly silent. I think most philosophers would have been more vocal. And I think there were at least two possible strategies, and these are not exclusive, of course. One was to maybe provide, to devote probably 10 years and an entire book to debunk reses. Rather, I mean, very apt, but at the same time, rather opportunistic reading of posthuman life in the framework and in the context of writing intelligence and spirit. And David could have provided or tried to provide indeed a robust epistemological toolkit that would allow us to somehow grasp the shape of the future, which in my view, that would have been contradictory with the counterintuitiveness and the unbounded openness to astonishment that characterizes speculative posthumanism. Or he could take his own daring proposal to its final consequences and to try to push the boundaries of what could be thought and written within the framework of speculative posthumanism, now understood not narrowly as a philosophical enterprise, but as an adventure in thought. Doing that instead of humanistically adapting to the demands of neo-rationalism, which has its own way of conceiving and of doing epistemology. And I think, I do really think that Snuff Memories is, in a way, among other things, a way of saying I am not forced to provide an explication, or at least I am not forced to provide an explication in a way that would be palatable to neo-rationalist stylistics and demands, because that's not the point. And I really welcome the kind of refusal to adaptation, this recalcitrance to adaptation, and this radical venture that is Snuff Memories, because it really changes the terms of the discussion. It really turns the situation into more than a discussion, because not everything that is epistemologically relevant and interesting happens within the discursive constraints and the rules of the game of giving and asking for reasons. And I really loved, Amanda, the concept of the space of snuff. The space of snuff may partially overlap, but does not coincide with the space of reasons. And that's one of the most intriguing aspects of speculative posthumanism writ large, and of Snuff Memories in particular. And I also think that Snuff Memories is also more locally, I think is relevant because it expands not only the limits of what we used to call or still call speculative posthumanism, again, now not narrowly understood as a philosophical current or undercurrent, but it also expands the limit of what we understand as science fiction, which is my field. And here's what I was driving at, right? And of course, Lovecraft, Ligotti, masters of horror and science fiction are explicitly mentioned in the text, and their stylistic and thematic influences are evident. But I think Snuff Memories is a weird creature in its own right. And it really forces us, at least us who try to do literary studies, but I hope not only, to adjust and to widen our narratological assumptions, conceptions, and categories. The centuries-old formulation, we don't know what a body can do, or no one knows what a body is capable of doing, depending on the translation, had already become a refreshing question with the publication of Posthuman Life, and becomes a refreshing issue again after the publication of Snuff Memories. This text really forces us to reassess our narratological assumptions regarding what is a character. How is the body of a character physically constituted, and how it may change? What does it mean for X or Y kind of body, or state of the art of a body? What does it mean for that kind of body to feel pain? What do we mean by pain? What do we mean by pleasure? Again, the now centuries-old question of the quality and the feasible intransferability of one's own pain becomes refreshing again. Pain becomes a particularly elusive and equivocal concept / affect or plus affect. What kind of verisimilitude corresponds to this text? What can happen and what cannot happen within the constraints of this fictional world, if it is a world indeed, because it also engulfs many other narrative and non-narrative universes and multiverses. How is this world populated? Can all modes of existence populating this world survive the constant whip or whiplash of affect? Can affect survive incarnation? What or who comes not after the subject, as Nancy put it, but after the body or after a body? Questions posed in the text like, what can the passions do after bodies, ought to be taken literally here. At face value, these questions make themselves suddenly available and pertinent narratologically and aesthetically, and they demand our attention not only because of how cool or how beautifully sounding they are, but because they really make us think again, read again, ask ourselves again, what kinds of assumptions about character traits, agency, intentionality, unity, feasibility, what kinds of assumptions we bring with us as baggage every time we open a book. And I think Snuff Memories is a game changer in that regard, and I do hope it does not go unnoticed, and I certainly hope it doesn't get reduced to the roundness of a concept or the calcification of a philosophical paradigm. So all this to say, cheers to the challenge that is this book. Cheers to disturbance, cheers to being a perennially incompetent reader of Snuff Memories, cheers to happily trying and happily failing to grasp what this book is about time and time again, and cheers to perhaps abandoning the question of aboutness once and for all. And yes, I mean, cheers to weird creatures. Please keep them coming. And I do have two questions. Do I have time for questions?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I do have two questions. Very briefly, since I am a structuralist of sorts, my tribe doesn't allow me to ask questions about authorial intention or what were you thinking while you were writing, etc. But I am interested in writing experiences. So not as an author, but as a question mark person, as a being, asking about the sort of aesthetically, intellectually, bodily incarnated experience of going through this adventure, even if you cannot recompose the actual steps. This text definitely does not leave the reader unchanged, and I can imagine that that's also a process that the writer as reader undergoes. So that's one question. What does it mean to bodily embark on an adventure like this one, and to be open to this unbounded adventure? And the other one, I swear, I wasn't planning to say anything else about new rationalism, but yesterday a series of tweets were brought to my attention thanks to the mutant Brazilian who brought them to my attention, and I think they're incredibly timely. They weren't talking about Snuff Memories, they weren't referring to Snuff Memories, but they really point to I think a common misunderstanding, and a misunderstanding that I used to share as well. And I'm gonna read the tweet and then I'm going to ask my question. So the tweets read: what some people to this day cannot distinguish is the difference between a piece of experimental fiction written with utmost attention to philosophical details and a piece of fiction marketed in a way that everyone should read it as a new paradigm of philosophy. No fiction will ever reach the status of the construction for which philosophy is known. And hence, this is why the greatest works of literature begin with a philosophical assumption. So as a person who has been trying to understand what literature is, or what literariness is in Russian formalism parlance, I don't even understand this. I really don't understand this statement. There's no intention behind it, but I do think it's just this impossible kind of identification established or presupposed between a literary work and an impulse or a desire, an inhuman desire for sure, to achieve the status of philosophy, which is assumed to have some sort of prestige that literature craves but cannot ever scratch. There is this idea that experimental fiction is some form of imperfect or informal theory that aspires to become a philosophical system or a new unsystematic paradigm of philosophy, and that if fiction were to reach a certain constructive or compositional status, then it would be almost indistinguishable from philosophy itself. I mean, I have my own reasons to disagree with this, but I was wondering how you used to think about the relationship between philosophy and fiction, and how you position yourself now before tension between the two and after these writing experiences, right? Yeah, I think this is a relevant topic now. So this is not for the sake of controversy, but for the sake of conversation. And thank you so much again.
And thank you so much, Romina. That was I think it was an epically brilliant failure. If you want to qualify it in those terms, I mean, and once again, I think bringing, you know, insights and perspectives that I hadn't really considered before. It's interesting, yes, obviously your reference to Reza Negrestani and Intelligence of Spirit. I mean, obviously I'd written a certain amount of, in a straight philosophical, with my philosopher's hat on, about issues like the way the space of post-human possibility is constrained or unconstrained by the space of reasons, and that's obviously an abiding issue. The point I'd got to within my own thought about speculative posthumanism while I was writing this book was, in a sense, an impasse, a philosophical impasse, that, in a sense, for the reasons that Reza set out. I mean, I was arguing that that once you pursue speculative posthumanism to the limit, you are, in a sense, left with very little purchase on, if you like, the shape of the space of posthuman possibility. And that I mean, I think that can be justified as a philosophical project in itself. I don't think philosophy is bound necessarily to provide a map through that space. I mean, I think that role can be outsourced, if you like, to other disciplines and other forms of knowledge, which I'm not necessarily best qualified to do that. So one consequence of that, I think, is that, as Amy Ireland put it in her review of the book, paraphrasing me, that in order to understand the posthuman, we have to make it. Okay, so the ideal perspective from which to understand the posthuman is one where it's already produced. Hence, the very act of production is itself gratuitous, and in a sense can't be understood from an intellectualist or rationalist position. In a sense, it has to be libidinal or outside the space of reason. Even the decision to enter the space of reasons, the decision to participate in the future in itself is not, as I see it, it's a precondition maybe for some kind of rational discourse about the future, but it's not itself rational. So certainly part of what Snuff Memories is doing is going to, I think, to a point, in a sense, having kind of destruction tested a certain philosophical position in a number of publications. Part of what Snuff Memories is doing is, in a sense, dealing with the fallout of that in a way that a philosophy can't do. Because in a sense, a lot of what I was trying to do was to show to philosophically describe the points at which philosophy would be impotent in the face of some kind of posthuman becoming. And so it seems to me that here, the literature, or if you want to call it that, experimental writing, is functioning autonomously. It's not in service. It's in dialogue with philosophy, but it's not conditioned by it or constrained by it, and certainly doesn't aspire to the condition of philosophy. The book is not a systematic treatise, obviously, and in the sense that the whole point of the book is for it to come apart, for it not to amount to a world, but to unmake the worlds that it produces. So yeah, again, I kind of feel, you know, I feel equally inadequate. So that's kind of a response to the first question. The second question, which is kind of about the experience of writing it. You know, obviously, you know, this book brings together a lot of obsessions, a lot of fixations, some philosophical, some literary, some kind of psychosexual. In a sense, they're all kind of being made to work through the literary devices, in the sense that I'm setting up. That process, as I said, is to some extent opaque. I mean, I think most of the time I was writing this book, I wasn't necessarily expecting to succeed. In a sense, it was written, you know, while confronting the perennial possibility of failure, but simply because I had no model to go on. I wasn't working within a genre, and I've found, I mean, I've always found literature or fiction much harder than philosophy to do, precisely because when I do try and do it, I don't seem to work within genres. Maybe because I'm too self-conscious about genre distinctions and genre boundaries that I feel I have to mash them up. But the point is that you know, the experience was one of constant insecurity, and it, in a sense, alluding to another of your topics, pain. You know, it wasn't a, I mean, I enjoyed writing some of it, but most of the time it was a fairly anguished process. I think I don't find this stuff easy, but at the same time, like the characters in like my own characters, there was a kind of, you know, there was a kind of necessity, a desire that I couldn't kind of countermand, that drove me to do it in the face of the, you know, apparently inevitable suffering and failure that lay before me. You know, so to some extent, the experience of writing the book is kind of elaborated in the narrative itself. As for the nature, yeah, I was having I had a conversation about pain with Bogna Konio for the in an interview she did with me, where she asked me a series of intimidatingly brilliant questions, and one of them was about the role of pain in posthuman life, but also here, and obviously, you know, insofar as there is an account of, or a narration of pain, and in Snuff Memories, it's ambivalent. It's you know, this is about bodies going to the limits of what bodies can do or be, and in a sense, pain is an inevitable concomitant of that. So in a sense, whatever the kind of erotic desire that drives the narrative, and I think in a sense that is the kind of rocket fuel that drives the book, is not a desire for a particular kind of fulfillment or pleasure. And in a sense, pain provides a kind of, and I guess, sort of sadomasochistic narrative or discourse provides a way of conceptualizing that complete sort of abandonment of organic constraint in the face of an entirely indeterminate future.
Thank you.
Okay, we need to, I realize we need to yeah.
Okay, we'll go to the next guest.
Yes.
Thank you, David, for your response, and thank you, Romina. What a talk.
Thank you so much.
Our next guest is Martin E. Rosenberg. Martin E. Rosenberg wrote his dissertation on the cultural work across the arts of the scientific concept of emergence. He recently published on emergent behaviors visible in music notation, in jazz improvisation and composition, and currently researches the cognitive neuroscience of improvisers, recently publishing essays on embodied cognition and improvisation, as well as jazz as neuroresistance, with reference to research on cognitive capitalism. Martin has programmed instructional software, theorized about hypermedia and interaction design, and contributed articles on the role of metaphor in transdisciplinary inquiry. Passing the mic to Martin.
Hi. Thank you, David and Sepideh, for inviting me, and I'm honored to be included among really wonderful presentations today. David probably knows that I started out with a PhD in English and hate literary criticism and had hoped never to do it again. And by reference to Amanda, I also had my second Moderna shot on Wednesday and got hammered. So I've tried to pull together something. It's not that long, and I hope it's in the spirit of these remarkable papers that that I've heard this afternoon. So on that note, why don't I start in? So I'm recalling David's reference. I wanted to start this with reference to the Amy Ireland quote, which goes, "The posthuman cannot be known before it is produced, so to know it, we must produce it." And I think that David, by doing fiction philosophy, if that's a word that we can use, is really trying to create it. So I'd like to think of Snuff Memories as a diorama of contingently failed inventions of the posthuman. In other words, can coming death become becoming life? And if no, is that an implicit endorsement of Daniel Dennett's reference to the failure of imagination, which David refers to in Posthuman Life? So this diorama reminds me of the scene of the cauldron in Terminator 2 that Amanda was referring to as well, where the superfluid metal Terminator tries to, over and over again, to transform into various beasts that emerge only to dissolve back into the cauldron. So is Snuff Memories about failure of the imagination? Is the failure due to a flaw in cognition? And this possibility reminds me of the quotation from Alistair Gray in his work Lanark. Man is the pie that bakes and eats himself, and the recipe is separation. So I wonder if Snuff Memories confronts the necessity to overcome isolation, an ethical imperative for distributed cognition to emerge. This requires us to pause and think about the nature of failure for the hermaphrodite narrator, the cabal, the Caracalla, the Prometheans, the rose. And is pain a sign for failure, the failure of isolation? So let me talk about success and failure briefly. reading Snuff Memories between the island of Dr. Moreau and Marcel Duchamp. So in The Island of Dr. Moreau, Wells presents us with failed experiments by which Dr. Moreau explores bridging the gap between the so-called animal and the so-called human, as opposed to the human and the post-human. The succession of sections in Snuff Memories seems as well to present us with emerging isolados and aggregations that seem to know, in the words of Neil Young, that everyone knows this is nowhere and will go nowhere. But these failures might also point to a Duchampian meta-irony in the non-dialectical play that he engages in between delay and exposure. Duchamp's career presents us with serial deviations from an aesthetic norm, only to collapse the emerging line of conceptual flight as if to celebrate the deviation, the bifurcation as individuation rather than the implicate school of Dada, Surrealism, Fluxus, and so forth. He does so, Duchamp does so, to make visible the blankness beneath, as if to say, you're not as blank as you think you are. For David Roden, that blankness is the mesh, which recalls both a cesspool and David Bohm's implicate order. There are three quotes that might frame the mesh. Quotation number 1. Here is what Ligotti might describe as the churning latrine of the absolute, of an insubordinate nature or undialectical future. We and it are lost to words as I know you are or will be someday. If we disavow this effect, it only resurfaces with better injuries. I breathe it in and exhale, not the body of the ego, but the corpus ego. And here's quotation number 2. There is nothing to be said then, not because there is nothing, but because mesh as the individuator precedes individuals. So, one might say that between the churning latrine and the individuating continuum lies the possibilities for the post-human, the manifestations of which emerge as if out of the logic of algorithmic possibilities. So here's quotation number 3. We're such idiots to think in symbols or believe the mind alone thinks, that we are rarefied nothings appended to landscapes floating above forest and temple. Perhaps that's why we're glad our image of life is a frozen steppe, free and unconditioned and violent with new energy. So now let's talk about the mesh. With the mesh, we are never without criteria, which of course is the lesson of free jazz, which is one thing that came to mind as I started to read Snuff Memories. Or what is the hermetic vocabulary and scholarly apparatus doing in Snuff Memories that doesn't mimic T.S. Eliot? So, one of the myths of free jazz is that its sonic landscape is free from laws, and this is simply untrue. Free jazz is profoundly organized. It embraces contingent flow of duration only upon the conceptual and proprioceptive mastery of all the laws that are about to be broken. And the reverse is also true. For example, the song Memories of Tomorrow emerges in the middle of Keith Jarrett's Cold concert from the head of Zeus, fully clothed. The scholarly apparatus of David Roden's Snuff Memories parodies hilariously that of Another Wasteland, but the references of Snuff Memories comes not from mythos or poesis, but though it ranges wildly, much of it from post-human philosophy and fiction. Are we back to Dennett's failure of imagination? Perhaps this points to David's artistic gift, as he puts it, more comfortable as collator than ideologist, unquote. Here we might think of the referential range of this novel as how full the emptiness of implicate order is and how self-referential. As David Roden put it in an email to me, to be clear, I think the universe of Snuff Memories isn't a nihilistic one entirely devoid of meaning and normativity. If anything, it is rotten with it, a radically pure war universe. If the Kabbalists' war can be assigned to any content, it is a kind of rebelling against meaning and thus against life. And yet, life and meaning is implicate. In its war against meaning, then, Snuff Memories puts into play and turns the eros of civilization into a pornography of the process of signification in order to turn implicate panpsychism into the explicate and then back onto itself self-referentially into something of scummy substance. As Roden says, to touch a pair of lips and at the same time know that it was a pair of lips. To watch everything is so deceptive. So that's all I have.
Well, thank you, Martin. That's amazing. I really like the the ball you're serving me here in terms of the references to free improvisation as well, as a, you know, as an occasional jazz pianist and keyboard player. So
a serious one, I might add.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, back to the mesh. I think part of the way Snuff Memory uses, I mean, Snuff Memory is riddled with philosophical references, but I think it's kind of using philosophy to kind of motivate its own kind of self-replicative structure, if you like, to provide some kind of, you know, liminal, less a world, but a kind of ontology from which a world might be exuded, or many worlds might be exuded, you know, one nature after another. And in fact, you know, one of the ideas I draw on, which I was kind of deriving from Ian Hamilton Grant's work on Schelling, is the idea that in a sense there's something inherently contradictory in the very idea of a unitary nature. If you think of nature as a capacity, as that which, like the mesh, accounts for individuals, it itself doesn't have the stability or exactitude that we can ascribe to individuals. So the mesh is inherently open, amorphous, self-organizing, self-mutilating, and it's to some extent to do with our enmeshment, in a sense, with things, particularly with technologies, you know. So it's not clear to me, for example, whether there's such a thing as, you know, there's a direction to technological change. I mean, you know, we're used to the idea that technological futures are very hard to predict, you know, and it seems an interesting challenge to think of that our technological mesh as, in a sense, as counterfinal, as elaborating, and, you know, through, you know, various forms of complex cause and effect, but without any kind of intelligent design. Which I guess brings us to Dennett. So Dennett, the full quote is that if I'm paraphrasing wildly, is that the endemic kind of, you know, the primordial sin of philosophers is to see in the failure of imagination and insight into necessity. You know, so because we can't imagine. I mean, I'll give you a really simple example. I remember reading in one primer on philosophy of mind that it seems impossible for us to imagine us having a perceptual experience that we are not, in a sense, able to, well, that seems to be built into having perceptual experience that we judge that we are perceiving. You know, we can't not judge that we are perceiving, or we can't infer that we're not perceiving while we're perceiving. That seems contradictory. And yet there are kind of strange pathologies of the mind, precisely where people who aren't blind claim they're blind, you know, various forms of agnososia, I think. I can probably got the term, but in any case, they do, you know, that many of the assumptions we make about what kinds of minds are possible, what kinds of mental states are possible, can be are fallible. So here I'm referring back to Romina's intervention, that it seems actually a responsible philosophical undertaking to kind of trace the limits of philosophical reason in the face of, you know, within a particular domain, here the deep technological future. I mean, in terms of, yeah, the literary and musical analogues, I guess the writing of Snuff Memory was very much like the construction of a sort of, you know, of a kind of Deleuzian smooth space, where, or a space rather than with Euclidean space, where you have some kind of totalized viewpoint which describes how that space operates at every point within it. A smooth space, like a Riemann space, is always constructed in terms of its local properties and the relationship between locals within that space. And to some extent, the production of Snuff Memories was like that. You know, that at each point I was discovering ways of, in a sense, linking the elements within a greater whole, sometimes, as I said, facing a cliff, you know.
Differentials lead to relations.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So to some extent, the ontology was recapitulated, you know, rather as in Romina's case, the sadomasochism was a recapitulation of the production. So was the in a sense was the kind of toy ontology that I was kind of throwing in there. One of the, I think there are probably many ontologies within Snuff Memories, because, you know, I was able to be philosophically irresponsible. And as I think you're right about free jazz, when it's done properly, it's always involves listening and responding to, in a sense, immanent tendencies within the musical material, to use rather kind of Adornian parlance. But and I mean, I hope, you know, I hope that's what resulted here. And I think for me, it's kind of the only condition on which any kind of artistic and certainly literary undertaking is worthwhile. I mean, if I know what I'm going to write before I write it, then I don't really see the point in doing it, you know, unless it's a, you know, for an academic journal somewhere. So I better shut up at this point.
And with that, David Roden will start the panel discussion based on the presentations. Please, panelists, feel free to unmute yourselves and respond to David and respond to each other. And if you have any questions from each other, feel free to contribute to the conversation. Okay, David?
Okay, yeah, I mean, first off, really I want to thank Seti for being kind enough to moderate this discursive assemblage, and to Sepideh Majidi for instigating it, for making it all possible, and putting in so much effort and imagination into producing it. I mean, you know, so thank you, Sepideh and Seti. I mean, just you know, it wouldn't have been possible without you. So, you know, what can I say? But thank you. Yes, I can clap. Right. I mean, I'm sort of. I mean, to some extent, my role at this point is liable to lead to embarrassment, because there's no way that I can really do justice to the sophistication and insight of the panels, you know, tonight. I mean, it's, as I said, I think I said before, I suppose it's a strange experience to start to read your text through others' eyes, and in a sense to see possibilities for interpretation, and kind of what possibilities for the use of a text. And I'm wondering, you know, it does make me wonder whether a text like Snuff Memories is actually good for anything, whether there is anything that can be done with it apart from read it, be shocked by it perhaps, or be provoked. I mean, that maybe is a question to throw back. I mean, it was certainly something I was thinking when listening to Amanda's intervention. I hadn't thought of Snuff Memories so much as a kind of, as a directly political or critical text, but I think in the way, in her elaboration of snuff as a rhetoric, or as a mode of presentation of the contemporary, I'm really bound to rethink that, and that I think is a really, I mean, in a sense, snuff is, you know, I mean, snuff obviously is a genre of pornography in which death is eroticized. So is there something about the very structure of our experience, in a sense, which lends itself to analysis through that genre? I don't know. I mean, I think this is just something I want to throw back.
Can I?
Yeah, do, yeah.
Very briefly, I think, thank you for referring to that, because it's precisely what I was trying to get at, that and maybe it refers back to Romina's point about the relationship between what we're calling the space of reasons, and, you know, what we might oppose to that, whether you frame it or anyone frames it in context of the libidinal or fiction or any other identification, whether it's constructed or unconstructed, let's say. So I was interested in the rhetoric of it all, because what the as we know, the very cleverness of snuff is that it convinces us that it is unconstructed. It's constructed to perform its nature, and one of the, I guess, the political concerns I have is how, when we easily, as the Terminator reference did, maps capital onto life to such an extent that we cannot, we don't discriminate between the two anymore. We're kind of left with these spaces that are given to us, that are constructed, but we take as real and accept them. So my kind of question around rhetoric is also a question of, like when I was saying, the book in many ways does explication. It explicates snuff as a rhetoric. And that doesn't mean that the world it produces is any the less mobilized or real to us in fiction. So I guess what I was thinking about is how if we accept without reason, we don't want to reason the world of snuff, then we just allow this kind of embeddedness between capital and life to persist. We don't want to explicate the relations nor intervene in them because we have naturalized it so fully. So, you know, I keep saying this, but as an artist, as a kind of maker of fictions myself, you know, I don't see the space of my production of fiction in my work to be something that is beyond reason. In fact, it comes out of like a whole lot of trying to find the reasons within causes. And that might end up in my work constructing something that is very hard to find the reason within, right? But the very fact that we're sitting here today, finding the reasons within causes is part of the discursive space of reasons that we've been talking about. And I don't think finding reasons in this way closes things down in any sense. In fact, it's just the same thing that I just described in art making. It actually leads to the production of new forms that need again to be reasoned with or about. So for me, it's not this kind of idea that the space of reasons reduces or simplifies in any sense. In fact, it could be a really proliferating constructive space where we don't know what we will get. And for me, that's what I was asking about in a way, is that there could be a very interesting dialectic going on in this piece you've offered to us, and I think many people have spoken about this today, actually, that comes out of new discriminations between the finite and the infinite that might not rest upon the assurances of the finite and the infinite conditions of what we'd seen historically or that have constructed political spaces for us before. So I'll stop there, but I just think that a lot of people have referred to this, whether it's through the theological or through the image or through questions of literal mortality of bodies and stuff like that.
Can I just add that I fully agree with Amanda with what you were saying about the sort of the dimension or the constraints or lack of constraints of the space of reasons. I fully agree with that, and I didn't mean to imply that the space of reasons and the space of snuff are not intertwined, or that the space of snuff is intractable from the standpoint of the space of reasons. What I meant to say is that demanding the kind of shape and the kind of epistemological methods and discursive genres that are required in order for us to be satisfied with the explication that David is supposedly forced to provide, that is what I find disturbing. I welcome disturbance because it actually shakes the constraints of what we thought to be the space of reasons. It's not intractable, but it doesn't, to break the, precisely to work with form in order to push the boundaries of what we thought was tractable or intractable. That's what I mean to, and that's what I was pointing to, but I absolutely agree.
Yeah, I guess even the, just alluding back to my response to Martin, even the kind of now the metaphor of spatiality at work in the phrase space of reasons can be, can be opened up, and what is the shape of that space, does it have hummocks and hillocks, and what is its curvature, Where, you know, does it bottom out in places that we perhaps can't even imagine? I mean, it's something I've thought about in a very abstract way in some of my philosophical work. So, for example, I allude in passing to the idea of a hyperplastic or hyperplasticity in talking about the fate of the Prometheans. And a hyperplastic entity is basically the end product of, you know, self-augmenting, self-legitimating reason. Once you have a creature that's capable of altering its substrate almost arbitrarily, you know, so it's no longer, in a sense, subject to any kind of natural constraint. I've argued that, in a sense, the kind of psychological discourse that on which much of the language of the space of reason depends is no longer applicable. You know, such a being would no longer have any need for reasons or need for psychology, because they wouldn't be of any help in understanding its own future development. You know, it's an entirely paradoxical idea in a way. And certainly has no better empirical basis than Descartes' God, probably somewhat less. So it's really just there's a sort of provocation for thinking about what, in a sense, the limit of reason is. What is the limit of the development of, for example, personal collective autonomy? Is that in itself something that we could even recognize as rational or personal or as a subject? So that you know, so but I entirely agree with Amanda that, you know, obviously the very fact that this is a written text with, you know, that I carefully referenced, you know, I've designed it to be legible, even, you know, within limits, and you know, and it's designed to be taken apart and analyzed and, you know, hopefully worked with as we're doing. Yeah, Corey, you need to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yep. So I kind of wanted to follow up on this line of questioning, I think, because a couple of different times I've heard you sort of invoke this language of the limits and probing the limits of reason and how that relates to posthumanism. And of course, when I think of probing the limits of reason, then I think of Kant's critical project, right? And so I'm wondering how you might situate, if not Snuff Memories, then maybe your work in posthumanism more generally to a sort of Kantian, or if we don't want to be that restrictive, something like a critical project.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's something I take very seriously in posthuman life, and that's because one way in which you might want to future-proof philosophy is by having some account of what the limits of you know, what if you like, what the invariant conditions for rational subjectivity or agency are, and that's sort of one of the ideas that falls out of the critical project, that in a sense we can say something about what the world has to be like, because there are constitutive conditions for experiencing that world, and in the set which legitimate a certain kind of logical machinery for talking about that world, you know, substance, accident, cause and effect, whatever. So that seems to me, you know, something like that project or some successor to that project seems to be essential if we're going to kind of map the future without having any access to the empirical content that future might furnished by no longer being a future, by becoming present. But of course, there are kind of many ways in which that critical project can be undertaken, and obviously, so for example, you can historicize the a priori, whether as many kind of 20th century thinkers from Hilary Putnam to Michel Foucault have done. So you can argue that there needs to be some framework, some organizing framework, but it doesn't have to have a fixed form. It can be responsive to the demands of empirical theory and that kind of thing. So I guess, so what I mean by an unbound posthumanism is one which consistently kind of pushes at the limits of that critical project and questions its right to delineate the posthuman future, which is, I guess, if there's a kind of, which is, I guess, why Reza might have a beef with my work, since, insofar as I understand the position that he set out in Intelligence of Spirit, it pretty much presupposes that whatever future intelligence there is will be some kind of apperceptive subjectivity, not a Kantian subject, not one bound by a fixed set of, not one bound by the 12 categories that Kant sets out in the Critique, but some kind of some collective space of articulation which we could recognize as being mediated through language, or something like language, or something like computation. And I mean, I think that's a fascinating, it's a fascinating and brilliant project in its own right. And it's just my project is to kind of push at the limits of that project. So, to that extent, it's I guess it's probably closest to a kind of Deleuzian take up of the transcendental project, which is in a sense to question the legitimacy of sort of language bound categories, or kind of exact distinctions in the face of the reality that the reality that constitutes it. Well, I'm not a Deleuzian, but I do find that project fascinating so far as I understand it. Whether that also constitutes a critical project, or as opposed to a return to some kind of classical metaphysics, I'm not sure.
Can I ask something? I was hoping to get you to respond to the fictional world that you created and ask, what is the relationship between pain and isolation?
Ooh. Have you got a context for that question? I obviously I can think of lots of places where pain is discussed in the text. But what about, are there any particular references to isolation that you had in mind, or is that just a more general question? Sorry to kind of
I'm looking for one right now.
Respond to a question with a question. But
well, here's one that doesn't really talk about pain, but it is hovering. From the section called The Blocks. Are we such interlopers, dream organisms like the Caracali? It isn't clean or simple. You are wedded to a self by a subpersonal meta-representational model. The auditor never releases you from you. I can't help the way I see it. What kind of ending did you expect? That death wouldn't be a typical or fragile conceit.
Right. Okay. That's really helpful, actually, because I mean, one of the things I'm again doing quite irresponsibly is channeling Thomas Metzinger's idea that that consciousness, that first-person consciousness is actually a kind of, and our experience of being a self is actually a kind of virtual reality generated by actually very non-selfy kind of processes, subpersonal processes, and that what we experience as a self is actually the referent of a model of the world that we produce in order to make that world tractable, but that model doesn't actually exist. So our experience of being in kind of finite time and bodily space,
it's like executive function is
actually illusion. I mean, there's time is not limited. Time is not limited to the last 3 minutes of conscious experience. That's just the way we kind of have to model it to make it tractable. I mean, I might also bring in mention R. Scott Bakker's idea of the blind brain, that the very condition of being a kind of functioning organism with a nervous system means that when that nervous system reflects on its own operations, it has to kind of drastically simplify them. Otherwise, as Metzinger also says, it will be kind of subject to explosive computational demands. You'd have to have a brain to kind of a second brain to figure out your first brain, and a third brain, it's got a recursive explosion of computational demands. So so the idea then is, and here there's a kind of link, there's a link both to the auditor in Beckett's Not I, and to the similarly hooded, cowled figure in Maya Deren's Meshes of the Afternoon. There's another mesh, which, absolute masterpiece of modern experimental film, where Deren is, in a sense, confronted by this hooded figure that may be, in a sense, her own kind of dark precursor or doppelganger. So there is the idea, in the sense that, we think of ourselves as beings of a certain kind, floating above the forest or whatever, disembodied selves, perhaps, because we are wedded by our own biology to do so, and it may be the ways in which we are constrained to think about ourselves are actually ripe for some kind of failure, some kind of radical alteration, rather as Scott Bakker, and I think Scott has been an influence on me as well, particularly in the way he uses popular forms of fiction like fantasy and the techno thriller to think about the limits of subjectivity and what he calls the semantic apocalypse, the idea that at some point in the development of techno science, in a sense, meaning will become, discursive meaning will both be revealed as illusory, but also become intractable.
I was just making another connection between the relationship of pain to pornographic excess, and the connection of pornographic excess to the Dionysian, which is a will to dissolving.
Yeah, I mean, I think the role of. Sorry, I interject.
No, go ahead.
Across you. I mean, I think the role.
I'm fumbling here because
no, well, we're all fumbling. Yeah. I think the role of, I mean, I think the role of pain in sexuality is really interesting, because I think it obviously pain can, for, I guess anybody who's into, bondage or SM, pain has an essential role within certain kinds of sexual practices. And as I understand it, I mean, pain can be nasty, but pain can also be expressive. So pain can function as a token of symbolic exchange within, a otherwise perfectly consensual, intimate relationship. And so, in a sense, pain, has at least two sides here. I don't see pain necessarily as privative or even necessarily negative. It can be, it can be exciting, it can be expressive, it can be in a sense beautiful, within, depending on the context. I think in the light of that, I think it's important that actually, although there is a lot of violent, there is a lot of, I guess, morbid or disruptive sexuality. It's not. I was quite careful not to write to write most of it as, in some sense, consensual. Within, now, I was discussing this the other night with my partner, because we were just interested in the representation of sex in the book, because there are limits to that. There are limits to consent, and there are obviously clear constraints around the consent that are to do with the way that world operates. So
if I could just interrupt here, for example, I think you use the word auditor. That's somewhat equivalent to executive function.
Well, it's actual figure in Beckett's stage direction.
Right.
The hooded figure that observes the mouth.
Yeah. So if executive function creates the illusion of separateness, and pain can be thought of, and maybe you don't think of, and here's a point where you could, not buy into the question at all. Pain is the register of the violation of corporal sovereignty. That's, I think, the connection that I'm trying to see between the condition of isolation and pain in your universe, in your landscape.
But I don't think pain is always functioning in that way. I think pain is also about the kind of opening up of that isolation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a double-edged sword.
Dispersive
No
forces.
pun intended. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I mean, alluding back to Bogner's question to me in the Araxium interview. I mean, there's a strain of thought in some of the political philosophy that comes out of Francois Lerouel's work, which identifies pain as a sort of basic, if you like, commonality, which binds us without any reference to kind of species boundaries. So in a sense, pain is a kind of potential basis for a posthuman politics. And I kind of play around with that, it not always in an entirely serious way, but I wanted to introduce that into the mix, that maybe pain is, the in itself, in some sense, the only thing that has some kind of, our only contact with some kind of intrinsic reality that we share in common with the rest of the universe.
Yeah, you just also, both of you reminding me, you and Martin reminding me of like the liberal position on pain, you know, in terms of Richard Rorty's philosophy of empathy, that if we can acknowledge that others are suffering, then it's the glue of a kind of liberal community, because it's only through, so in that sense, pain and violence underwrite liberalism and glue us together. So, but that is, this is kind of what I was getting at in that distinction between like the dialectical kind of situation of like the horror and snuff, because snuff complicates that massively, because it not only eliminates the truth of its orchestration, like it says this is real all the way down, you know, it tries to get rid of its artifice, but also it kind of requires consent, as you were saying. So consent to one's own oppression or one's own pain undoes the kind of say the kind of social glue of the pain that subtends like a liberal politics. Instead, we get the situation where in the world of snuff, we're all kind of apparently consenting to our oppression in a kind of Hobbesian sense, where no one signs off that contract, but it's kind of underwritten that we're all kind of agreeing to oppress ourselves in a world of pain. Whereas in like Rorty's liberal universe, some people aren't in pain, right? There's difference in order for us to recognize each other when we are in pain and when we are not. So I think that the kind of world of snuff, like really, like I say, complicates that massively, but also, like I said when in my little talk, that it bars us from the access to understanding the agreements or the consent that would be the consent to be oppressed. And I think that's I guess that's what came up when I read your book to me. It really did alert itself to me that, is this a kind of unilateral Hobbesian kind of, you know, underwritten, naturalized consent to be oppressed? Or are some people not in pain and get to see others and therefore do this liberal gluing together of the social? And, you know, I didn't recognize the liberal version, by the way, which is where I get this kind of more, the feeling of isolation that Martin's talking about, this Rousseauian dispossession, you know, of these wandering kind of identities, if you like, or characters.
Yeah. I mean, as I said, this kind of, when I was writing this, the idea that in a sense I was kind of modeling the experience of oppression under kind of, you know, planet spanning capital wasn't kind of the nearest thing to hand, and that perhaps is itself a kind of artifact of my own kind of you know, ideological position and distanciation within that structure. I mean, I think, you know, I mean, I think the eroticization of pain and death is complex here because, for one thing, the very values of the term pain or death that are themselves open to interpretation. They're in a sense self-problematizing. I mean, I think, as I say in my interview with Tom Bland in Spontaneous Poetics, I mean, you know, somebody can say, you know, I know a necrophiliac or whatever can say that they love to imagine being a corpse, and you know, and some people like to imagine being corpses. You know, that fine. But in the sense, if you're imagining being a corpse, you're not imagining being a corpse, because corpses can't experience anything. So, you know, in a sense, the very terms in which desire is articulated are already kind of drawing attention to their own kind of dubious provenance and warrant. Now, you know, whether that amounts, yeah, I mean, as I said, I'm still struggling to sort of see the political resonance of that. I mean, I'm sure it's there. I mean, your invocation of Rorty is really interesting because his liberalism is such a minimal one. I mean, that's a kind of about, you know, it's liberalism without any kind of you know, pretense at serious philosophical kind of foundation. It's nothing like a Rawlsian liberalism, for example. But I mean, I think it's just an interesting project then to consider, you know, in a sense, how we are kind of exposed to others' pain and how we kind of demarcate pain, what kinds of pain is acceptable, what kind of sacrifices are acceptable. I mean, you know, we've just been through a pandemic in the UK where, you know, upwards of 150,000 people have died, you know, largely because, you know, in part because, you know, the government was not really trying to eliminate the disease, but to try and, in a sense, render it compatible with some kind of economic activity, you know, and it's interesting how little political cost that seems to result in. And that, you know, so in a sense, pain aspect, you know, maybe part of the problem with liberal democracy is our inability to, in a sense, experience the pain of others as painful, or as humiliating, or as, you know, and that maybe is a blind spot in Rorty's account, that actually the problem is we you know, there's something, you know, there's something about the structure of mass society that actually renders that kind of postmodern liberalism impossible.
If there aren't any questions from the panelists, there's a couple of questions in the chat box.
Okay. Yeah, there's a couple in the Q&A box. Should I respond to those?
Yeah, and there's a couple in there. I don't know if you want to get to those, David.
Yeah, I'll start with the Q&A and then work. So I've got there's a great question from Francesco Taghvaei. I liked Corey's reference to Kafka's Odradek and David's claim that Snuff Memories is not about the lack of meaning, but rather the opposite, an overload of meaning. This reminded me of Adorno's interpretation of Kafka. Quote, Kafka's prose is a parabolic system, the key to which has been stolen. Each sentence says, interpret me, and none will permit it, unquote. David, would you say that this quote somehow described your book too? I'm beginning to think that it does, but you know, I think that's a really fascinating insight, Francesco. I'm not sure if I can add anything to it beyond what we've already discussed, but I think it kind of encapsulates something that we've been sort of following tonight. And there's a next one is from Chris Hunt. So I'm just reading this live. I haven't read it already. So I appreciate the details around texture of media, waves of noise, poor quality video, LFO, as well as the occasional confusion as to the location and agency of the images in the book. Are we seeing an image in the text? Is the text referring to existing media, etc.? I wonder in a super general way how this somewhat decentralized perspective, both narratively and formally, might map to a process of unfolding some kind of posthuman or non-bodily affective spaces. Yeah, so thank you, Chris. I mean, that's I'm glad you picked up on this. I mean, that, you know, there are some bits of the book that definitely come out of my you know, limited and fairly comprehensively incompetent experience with various kinds of electronic media and programming environments, and particularly music making. I think one of the reasons, and here I'm kind of sort of interpreting my own intentions, as it were, from the outside. One of the reasons I wanted to do that, and particularly through the use of sound, is precisely because sound is that is one of the as opposed to vision is an object that is most easy to divorce from its cause, as Schaeffer argued. You know, one of the features of, if you like, acousmatic music is precisely that we hear things that we can't easily assign to a natural cause. And so thinking about a history disclosed through, not merely through sound, but through sound media that can be constantly transposed, transcoded, is one way of, if you like, shaking any sense of ontological security in that history and in the world that it discloses. So in some sense, there are bits of Snuff Memories that are about a sound world, but it's kind of like an acousmatic sound world. Yeah, I mean, I think that may map on some idea of a kind of posthuman becoming, and that's in a sense an issue at all points in the text. You know, both in terms of the eroticism, but also in terms of the kind of, you know, my attempt to kind of make sort of gender roles and gender to some extent fluid and debatable, you know, bodies fluid and debatable. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts about either of those questions. I'm kind of feeling in danger of repeating myself, so.
If not, there's also a question from Daniel in the chat that we can move to.
Sort of open that up.
I can read it if you can't find it.
Yeah, there are quite a few.
Okay, Daniel Russell Laras asks, my question is the following. Since posthumanism and futurity are at stake in many of the interventions, I wonder why policy and the role of science regarding the current state of affairs are missing from the conversation. Should they not be at the front and center of the conversation, or are we to take refuge in theoretical debates about Hegel or Deleuze? Is that conversation truly outside of literary studies theory?
Yeah. I don't think it's, well, for my part, I mean, I've certainly in my non-literary output tried to engage with science and technology, I guess, and with you know, models or theories about what the sciences tell us, for example, about the mind and the way the mind works, or I think the scope of Snuff Memories is slightly different. It's not, as I said, it's not an attempt at world building in the way, for example, that, I don't know, someone like Kim Stanley Robinson would do. I'm not decrying that. I wish I could write that sort of stuff. I just can't. I'm more interested, in a sense, in the boundary questions about the in a sense, the points at which our empirical knowledge and our current models of the world aren't any use, are in a sense not providing any kind of shape to the noise from the future. So I think it's an entirely pertinent question. I just don't think the book is concerned with, although it references various kinds of science, from Metzinger's cognitive science to Badiou and set theory, and the idea of non-totalizable multiplicities. It's not directly concerned with extrapolating particular technologies or particular sciences. I mean, I think if you want fiction does that well, go read Kim Stanley Robinson or someone working at working in a different kind of literature, but it's not what this kind of writing is trying to do. As I said, I wish I could do that stuff too, but it's not in me. It's not the sort of writing I can engage in.
Could I add something here? It seems to me that referencing technical science, theoretical science, pervades the book. But it seems to me that Beckett's statement captures your relationship to these extra literary sources when he said, I only concern myself with the fundamental sounds. I'll let the others get headaches from the overtones. And it seems to me that we've been engaging in those overtones all afternoon, at least from Pittsburgh's point of view. But to make that science explicit is certainly not your job, perhaps.
Yeah, and can I just also add to that point? The phrasing of the question, so I'd say that no one, and this again, this is maybe I misunderstood the tone of the conversation, but I didn't hear anyone here, or nor the text, taking refuge in theoretical debates about Hegel and Deleuze. I don't think any of these interventions nor the text have that purpose or had that tone. So I was confused by that part. And precisely it goes back, David, to your comment about being able to be irresponsible in the context of writing a piece of experimental fiction that doesn't need to give the explanations that should be given in the context of a realist philosophical project that is committed to any philosophical project. So I do think that it is about getting rid of those, putting into parentheses those commitments in order to be able to not to free yourself, because as Amanda said, and as Martin said as well in relation to music, we are not free from constraints, but it is about putting those ontological and ethical commitments in parentheses, because we know how harmless, sadly, how harmless fiction is from a political point of view, but that also allows us to think unboundedly about topics that would be really, really risky to address in the context of a realist text. So I do think that Posthuman Life had a different kind of commitments, that had a different set of commitments, and in that context, to provide a map from the state we're in to the state of the art of technoscience to the emergence of hyperplastic agents would have been absolutely irresponsible at a very different level. So yeah. I don't understand. I don't know whether it's Daniel or Danielle, because I don't know where you're from, but that seems that the question it's really unsettling, not because what David is doing, or what literary studies do, is outside of the conversation of what's the role of science and of policy, but because the text should also be given the opportunity of being understood in its own terms. And I don't think that the text addresses the question of technology in such a straightforward manner, I think.
I just, yeah, I mean, I think that's really put really well, Romina. I mean, I'll just add one footnote to that. Really, it's one of the reasons I wrote Posthuman Life was because a lot of the discussion about transhumanism and posthumanism, as I at the time was, in a sense, almost too wedded to current models of what the future would be like. So whenever critical posthumanists like I don't know, Catherine Hales talked about transhumanism, they had one model or two models, maybe mind uploads for what transhumanism was about. Most of the bioethics debate was about speculative extensions of current technologies such as genetic engineering and artificial intelligence, which is and a lot of that stuff was really good. It's just it seemed to me at the time to be ignoring the problem raised by our lack of constraints on the futures that they were describing. There was in a sense, there wasn't a discourse. There wasn't, in a sense, the critical question that Corey raised earlier wasn't being asked in relation to the technological future in a lot of the material I was reading at the time. So Posthuman Life was just a kind of preliminary attempt to try and raise that critical question in relation to the technological future, which of its nature means abstracting from some of the details in terms of particular models of, for example, how genetic science might be used to make super intelligent babies, or ethically sourced meat, or whatever. That just wasn't within the purview of the kind of philosophical project I was undertaking, because I felt that there was another project that needed addressing, but I didn't see being addressed in some of the other stuff I was reading. But I think that to some extent that answer, as Romina points out, transfers to Snuff Memories as well. I mean, with qualifications, obviously.
Right, amazing. If there aren't any more questions, we can end our event. Okay, thank you, everybody. What an exciting discussion over the past 3 hours. Thank you for your participation. We've recorded this presentation and we'll post it shortly on different social media platforms. Thank you, David Roden. What a great conversation with our panelists.
Well, absolutely, yeah. Thank you, and thank you, Seti, and again, thank you, Sepideh, for setting this up. And I'm just bowled over and staggered by the quality of the panel. This was, when I decided this strange little text was finished around last October, it never occurred to me that anyone would actually frame a sort of intelligible questions around it. But these have been really brilliant responses, so thank you. I'm just humbled by them, and thank you all of you. I've just loved every moment of this.
Yes, thank you, David. Thank you, Amanda, Martin, Romina, Corey, and Simon. Thank you to all of our participants and attendees, and thank you to Foreign Objekt for curating, organizing, and hosting this event.